The old community hall in the small town of Millbrook had seen better days. The paint on the walls was peeling in the corners, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. But on the evening of the annual winter gathering, the hall was full of life. People came from every part of the town, old men with white hair, young mothers holding babies, teenagers who would rather be somewhere else but came anyway because their parents told them to. The tables were filled with food, the air smelled of warm bread and coffee, and the sound of people talking and laughing filled every corner of the room. Near the back of the hall, sitting alone at a small table, was a young woman named Clara. She was 23 years old, with dark brown hair pulled back simply and a plain gray coat that looked like it had been worn through many winters. She did not talk much. She sat quietly with a cup of tea in her hands and watched the people around her. No one paid much attention to her. She was not the kind of person who drew eyes when she walked into a room. She was quiet, ordinary, and easy to overlook. Clara had moved to Millbrook only 6 months ago. She came from a bigger city far away, and no one in town knew very much about her. She had taken a small job at the local library, helping to sort and organize books. She walked to work every morning, came home in the evenings, and kept mostly to herself. Her neighbors thought she was polite, but shy. The woman at the bakery said she always said thank you, but never stayed to chat. The librarian she worked with said she was a good worker, but never talked about herself. In 6 months, no one in Millbrook had learned very much about Clara at all. The evening was moving along nicely. Someone had set up a small stage at the front of the hall where a few people were supposed to perform. It was a tradition in Millbrook. Every year at the winter gathering, a few local people would get up and sing a song or play an instrument, just for fun. It was never anything very serious. People clapped and smiled and enjoyed themselves. The trouble started when the person who was supposed to play the piano did not come. His name was Gerald, an older man who had played the piano at these gatherings for many years. But Gerald had slipped on the ice earlier that day and hurt his wrist, and he had called ahead to say he could not make it. Without him, the stage felt empty. The organizer of the evening, a round and cheerful woman named Mrs. Patton, went around the room quietly asking if anyone could play even a simple tune, just to fill the time and keep the evening moving. Most people shook their heads. A teenager said she played a little bit, but was too nervous to go up front. An older man said he had not touched a piano in 30 years. Mrs. Patton was getting a little worried. The evening needed something. The piano sat on the stage doing nothing, and people were beginning to notice the empty space where the music was supposed to be. It was Clara's neighbor, a kind older lady named Mrs. Horn, who leaned over to Clara at the small back table and said softly, "Dear, do you play piano at all? You seem like someone who might." Clara looked up from her tea. She did not answer right away. She looked toward the stage, then back at her cup, and then she said quietly, "A little bit." Mrs. Horn's face lit up. She waved Mrs. Patton over and said, "This young lady says she plays a little. Maybe she can help." Mrs. Patton came over quickly and looked at Clara with hopeful eyes. "Oh, would you? Just something simple, anything at all. Just a tune to keep the evening going. Nobody expects anything special." Clara looked uncomfortable. She was not the kind of person who liked to be looked at, but the kindness in Mrs. Patton's face was hard to say no to, and Mrs. Horn was already gently patting her arm. Clara set down her tea and said, very quietly, "All right." People near the back noticed Clara getting up and walking toward the stage, and a few of them looked over out of simple curiosity. Most of the room was still talking, not really paying attention. A few children ran past the stage chasing each other. It was an ordinary moment in an ordinary evening in a small town. Nobody was expecting anything. Clara sat down on the small bench in front of the piano. The piano was old, a dark wood upright that had been in the hall for decades. A few of the keys had small chips in them. Clara ran her fingers along the edge of the keys without pressing them, and for a moment she just sat there, still and quiet. Someone near the front coughed. One of the teenagers whispered something to a friend. Mrs. Patton stood at the side of the stage with her hands folded, hoping for just something simple. And then Clara began to play. The first few notes came out so smoothly and so clearly that the people closest to the stage stopped talking. They did not know why exactly. It was something in the sound itself. The notes were clean and full and rich, not stiff or nervous the way a beginner sounds. They were the notes of someone who understood the instrument deeply. The melody that came from Clara's hands was not a simple folk tune or a holiday song. It was something larger, something that opened slowly like a door into a much bigger room. Within seconds, the chatter in the hall began to fall away. First, the tables closest to the stage went quiet. Then the ones in the middle. People who had been deep in conversation stopped mid-sentence and turned their heads. A woman who had been laughing at something her friend said slowly stopped laughing. A man who had been carrying a plate of food stood still where he was. Even the children running near the back slowed down without anyone telling them to, as if something in the air had changed. The music filled the hall completely. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the kind of music that finds you wherever you are standing and makes you stop and listen. Clara's hands moved across the keys with a certainty and a grace that no one in that room had expected. Her back was straight, her face was calm, and her eyes were half closed. She looked completely different from the quiet, ordinary woman who had been sitting alone in the back with her cup of tea. She looked like someone who had come home. Mrs. Patton stood at the side of the stage with her mouth slightly open. She had asked for a simple tune. She had expected something polite and small. What she was hearing was something else entirely. The music moved through different feelings, soft and tender at first, then building with a quiet power, then opening into something that felt wide and free. It was the kind of playing that people talk about when they say music can say things that words cannot. By the time Clara had been playing for 2 minutes, the entire hall was silent. Every single person had stopped what they were doing. The talking had stopped. The moving around had stopped. The children were still. Old men who had lived hard lives and were not easy to move sat with their eyes glistening. Young mothers held their babies a little tighter. The teenagers, the ones who had not wanted to be there at all, stood and watched with expressions that were completely open, without any of the usual boredom or coolness that teenagers were like a mask. Nobody in the room had known. Nobody had guessed. This quiet woman who sorted books at the library and never talked about herself had sat down at an old chipped piano in a peeling hall and turned an ordinary winter evening into something that no one in Millbrook would forget for a very long time. And Clara played on, the music pouring from her hands into the silence of the room, filling it with something warm and alive and real. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They only listened. And the old hall, which had seen many years and many evenings, held that music as gently as if it had been waiting for it all along. When the last note finally left the piano and dissolved into the quiet of the hall, there was a moment, a full, complete moment, where nobody made a sound. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that only comes after something truly beautiful, the kind where people need a second to come back to themselves, to remember where they are and what they were doing before the music took them somewhere else. Then someone began to clap, and then another person, and then, like a wave moving from the front of the hall to the back, the entire room broke into applause. It was not polite clapping, the kind people do out of habit at small-town events. It was real, honest, full-handed applause. People were standing up from their chairs. The teenagers, who had been leaning against the wall with their arms crossed, were clapping with everyone else, and some of them were shaking their heads slowly as if they still could not fully believe what they had just heard. Old Mrs. Horn, who had been the one to suggest Clara in the first place, had tears running quietly down her face and did not seem to mind at all. Clara sat on the bench for a moment after she finished. She looked almost surprised herself, as if the music had carried her somewhere and she was only now finding her way back. She turned on the bench and looked at the room, at all the people standing and clapping, and something in her face shifted. Not pride exactly, it was something softer, something like relief. Like a person who has been holding their breath for a long time and has finally been allowed to breathe. Mrs. Patton came to the front of the stage first. Her cheeks were pink and her eyes were bright. That was, she started, and then stopped, because she could not find the right word. She reached out and took Clara's hand and held it in both of hers. That was extraordinary, she finally said. Clara thanked her quietly and started to step down from the stage. But people did not let her go so easily. A man in a green jacket came forward and asked her what the piece was she had just played. A woman in a red sweater said she had never heard live piano playing like that in her life. A group of older men who had been sitting together at the same table all evening came over to tell her they had heard music in big city concert halls, and what she had just done was not one bit less than what they had heard there. Clara received all of this with a small, genuine smile and simple thank yous. She was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was clear that being looked at and praised was not something she was used to. It was a young man named Tom who asked the question that opened everything. Tom was 27, worked at the local hardware store, and was the kind of person who asked the things others were thinking but did not say. He stepped up to Clara while she was still surrounded by people and said, plainly and with honest curiosity, "Where did you learn to play like that?" The people nearby went a little quieter, wanting to hear. Clara looked at Tom for a moment. She seemed to decide something. She took a small breath and said, "I studied at a conservatory. For 9 years." The room went even quieter. Someone said, "A conservatory?" And Clara nodded. A conservatory, a serious music school, the kind where people go when music is not a hobby but a life. 9 years of training. The kind of education that turns talented children into real musicians. The kind that takes total dedication, long daily hours of practice, sacrifice, and an ability that most people simply do not have. People began to look at each other. The picture they had built of Clara in 6 months, the quiet library worker who kept to herself, the woman nobody knew very well, was being redrawn in front of them, and everyone could feel it. Mrs. Horn, who had followed her neighbor to the front of the room, sat down in a nearby chair and said gently, "Will you tell us how it all started?" She asked it the way a grandmother asks, not pushing, just inviting. And maybe it was that gentleness, or maybe it was the music still warm in the air, but Clara sat back down on the piano bench, facing the room now instead of the keys, and she began to talk. She was 7 years old when her mother first sat her in front of a piano. Her mother was not a musician. She worked long hours in a small grocery store, but she had found an old piano at a yard sale for almost nothing and had it brought home because she had always believed, in a quiet and unspoken way, that her daughter had something inside her that needed a way out. Clara had sat down at that piano on a Saturday morning and played with both hands for an hour without stopping. Her mother stood in the doorway of the room and watched, and she did not say anything, but her eyes were full. By the time Clara was 9, her piano teacher, a patient older woman who had taught dozens of children, told Clara's mother very carefully and very seriously that what Clara had was not ordinary. She said she had taught piano for 31 years and had never heard a child play the way Clara played. She said the child did not just learn music, she felt it. She understood it somewhere deeper than the brain. It was in her hands, in her timing, in the way she shaped every note. The teacher said Clara needed a bigger world than a small room in a small house with an old yard sale piano. Getting to a conservatory was not easy. The family had no money to spare. Clara's mother worked extra shifts and applied for every kind of financial support she could find. Clara was accepted into a prestigious conservatory program at age 12 with a full scholarship, after an audition where the judges, serious, experienced people who were not easily impressed, asked her to come back after she had played, just to be sure they had heard what they thought they had heard. She played again. And then one of the judges, a woman who had trained under some of the most famous musicians in Europe, set down her pen and said quietly, "Yes, this is real." The people in the hall in Millbrook listened to all of this without moving. The food on the tables was forgotten. The coffee was going cold. Nobody seemed to care. Clara spoke simply, without drama, the way a person talks about things that happened long ago but still live close to the surface. She talked about the years at the conservatory, the early mornings and the late nights, the hours at the piano every single day, the way music became the language she understood better than any other. She talked about competitions she had won, regional first, then national, then an international competition in Vienna when she was 19 that she had almost not entered because she did not believe she was ready. She had played Chopin in that competition, in a grand hall full of judges and listeners and other brilliant musicians, and she had won first place. A woman near the back of the room made a small sound when she heard that. Someone else whispered to the person next to them, "Vienna, first place." This woman who sorted library books and said quiet thank yous at the bakery had won a piano competition in Vienna at 19 years old. Tom, who had asked the first question, asked the next one too. "So what happened? Why did you stop? Why are you here, in Millbrook, and not?" He gestured vaguely, trying to say the rest of the world. Clara looked down at her hands for a moment. The hands that had just moved over the piano keys with such ease and power. She was quiet for a few seconds, and when she looked up again her expression was steady but different. There was something behind her eyes that was not pain exactly, but was close to it. Something carried. Life, she said simply. And she smiled. Not a big smile, not a performed smile, but a real one, the kind that has something complicated behind it. Life happened, and I needed somewhere quiet for a while. Nobody pressed her further. The room seemed to understand without needing more words that there was a chapter there that was not ready to be opened, not in a town hall on a winter evening among people who were still strangers in many ways. And somehow the respect in that silence, the room choosing not to push, choosing to let her have her privacy, meant more than any amount of questions would have. Mrs. Patton, who had spent the evening managing things and keeping people comfortable, looked at Clara with a new kind of attention. Not just the warm gratitude of someone whose event had been saved, but something more personal. The look of someone who has just realized they have been passing something extraordinary every single day without knowing it. Outside the hall, the winter wind moved through the empty streets of Millbrook. Snow had started falling softly, the way it does in small towns, without hurry. Inside, the people of Millbrook sat close together in the warmth of the old hall, and they looked at the young woman on the piano bench, and they waited, not impatiently, but with the kind of quiet hope that only music can build in a room, to hear whatever she might give them next. Clara did play again that night. After she finished talking, after the room had held its respectful quiet for a few moments, she simply turned back to the piano. She did not announce it or ask if anyone wanted her to. She just turned, placed her hands on the keys, and began. In the hall, which had been slowly warming back to the low hum of people breathing and moving and being together, went still again all at once. She played 3 more pieces that evening. Each one was different. One was soft and slow, like something remembered from a long time ago. One was quick and playful, and the children in the room started to smile and sway without realizing they were doing it. The last one was the longest, and it built and built until it reached a moment so full and so large that several people in the room felt something move through them that they would have found hard to describe afterward. Not sadness, not joy, but something that held both things at the same time. When she finished the last piece, she sat quietly for a moment with her hands still on the keys. Then she lifted them, set them in her lap, and turned around to face the room again. The applause was even fuller than the first time. Some people were on their feet before she had even fully turned around. The room was not the same as it had been at the start of the evening. Something in it had shifted, the way a place shifts after something real happens there. That night, walking home through the snow, Clara felt something she had not felt in a long time. It was not easy to name. It was something like the first small movement of something that has been frozen and is very slowly beginning to thaw. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath coming out in white clouds, and she looked at the quiet, snowy streets of Millbrook and thought about the hall behind her, full of people who had listened, really listened, and had understood something about her that she had spent 6 months keeping to herself. What no one in Millbrook knew yet, what Clara had told no one since arriving in the town, was the full shape of what had brought her there. 3 years before that winter evening, Clara had been living a very different life. After winning the competition in Vienna, she had gone on to build a real career as a concert pianist. She had played in some of the most respected performance halls in the world. Her name had appeared on programs alongside musicians who had been famous for decades. She had a manager, a schedule full of concerts across different countries, and reviews that used words like luminous and once in a generation. She was 21 years old, and her life was full of music and travel and the kind of recognition that most musicians work their entire lives toward and never quite reach. And then, 2 months before what was meant to be her most important concert yet, a solo performance at a major festival in London that had been arranged a year in advance, her mother became seriously ill. Clara had gone home immediately. She had canceled the London concert, canceled the 3 engagements that followed it, and gone home to be with her mother. Her manager had been understanding, at first. Her mother's illness was long and difficult, the kind that does not move quickly, that takes a person slowly and asks the people who love them to be present every day, to give everything. Clara had given everything. She had sat beside her mother through the hard days and the harder nights. She had cooked simple meals and read books out loud and held her mother's hand through the long, quiet afternoons. The piano had gone silent. For almost a year, she had not played at all. Her mother had survived. She had come through the illness slowly, week by week, and she was now recovering well, living with Clara's aunt in a city 2 hours from Millbrook. She was not fully herself yet, but she was getting there. She was safe. But something in Clara had changed during that year. The world she had been living in before, the concerts, the reviews, the managers and schedules and travel, had felt very far away. It had felt like a life she had been living at great speed, and the long stillness of that year beside her mother had made it impossible to simply step back into the speed again. She had needed somewhere quiet, somewhere with no history, no expectations, no version of herself that anyone already had opinions about. She had found Millbrook on a map almost by accident, a small town, far enough from the city, with a library that needed help. She had told herself she would stay for a few months, just until she could think clearly again, just until she could find her way back to the piano on her own terms. But the months had passed, and she had stayed. And the piano at the library. There was a small practice room at the back of the building with an old, upright piano in it. She had been visiting quietly, early in the mornings before anyone arrived, playing alone in the still air of the empty library. She had been finding her way back, slowly and privately, in the way that healing always works when you stop forcing it. The evening at the hall had not been planned. She had not been ready for it, or she had not thought she was. But Mrs. Horn's gentle question and Mrs. Patton's hopeful face had pulled her up from her chair before she had time to think, and the piano had done the rest. Once her hands touched the keys and the first note rang out clear and full in the old hall, she had known, quietly and simply, that she was still herself, that the music had not left, that it had only been waiting, the way all real things wait, with great patience, for the right moment. In the weeks that followed the winter gathering, Millbrook changed toward Clara in a way that was noticeable but gentle. People greeted her more warmly when she walked through town. The woman at the bakery started to keep a particular kind of roll set aside because she had noticed it was the one Clara always chose. The librarian she worked with asked, carefully and with great respect, if Clara might be willing to play a short piece at the library's upcoming reading night for children. Clara said yes. She played at the library evening, and the children sat cross-legged on the floor and listened with their mouths slightly open. Their teachers stood at the back of the room and looked at each other. One of them, a young woman who taught music at the elementary school, spoke to Clara afterward and asked if she would ever consider coming to talk to the children about music, not necessarily to teach, just to talk. Clara thought about it for a week. Then she said yes. She came to the school on a Thursday morning and sat on a low chair in front of 24 children between the ages of 8 and 10. She talked to them about music the way she always talked about things, simply and honestly. She told them that music was a language, and like all languages, it could say things that regular words could not. She told them that anyone who wanted to learn could learn, and that the most important thing was not to be the best, but to be honest, to let what you felt come through when you played. She played a short piece for them on the classroom piano, and 24 children sat in complete stillness. One small girl in the back row raised her hand after Clara finished. She had 2 braids and a serious expression. She said, "Do you ever get scared when you play in front of people?" Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said yes. She said that playing for people was one of the most honest things a person could do, and honest things were always a little bit scary, because when you were honest, people could really see you. But she said it was also the best feeling she knew, to play something true and to have someone else hear it and understand. The girl in the back row nodded like this made complete sense. By the time spring came to Millbrook, Clara had begun to play again in a real way. She still lived quietly, still walked to the library each morning, still kept mostly to herself. But there was a small music group that had started meeting on Saturday afternoons in the community hall. People who played a little guitar, a woman who played flute, a retired teacher who played violin with stiff fingers but great love. Clara played piano with them, and it was nothing like Vienna, and it was nothing like London, and it was one of the most peaceful things she had ever done. She had written to her manager. She had said she was not ready to return to full concert life yet, but she was playing again, and she would be in touch when the time was right. Her manager had written back with 2 sentences, "Take the time you need. The music is not going anywhere." Neither was Millbrook. And some part of Clara, the part that had been so tired and so hollow when she arrived, had quietly decided that neither, for now, was she. The piano in the community hall still had chips in its keys and a slightly uneven sound on the lower notes. It was nothing like the concert grand pianos she had played on stages around the world. But when Clara sat down at it on Saturday afternoons, with the late light coming through the tall windows and the smell of coffee from the kitchen, and she placed her hands on those old imperfect keys and began to play, it felt, in the way that only true things feel, exactly right.